Okay, now everybody could make it. Welcome to our brown bag / chart speaker series lecture by Dr. Jason Metcalfe. I'll tell you a little bit about him. Since 2007, he's been at the Army Research Lab, specifically the Human Research and Engineering Director of the Combat Capabilities Development and Army Research Laboratory. It's the EC.
And that's actually not the full name.
That's right.
Just kidding.
U.S. Army Research Laboratory, Human Research and Engineering Director. Well, yeah, and the CCD. Anyway. It'll take the whole time if I say it.
He's worked on human interactions with advanced technologies such as autonomous and semi-autonomous mobility and other vehicle-based systems for use in both civilian and military settings. And he received his bachelor's and master's at the University of Illinois and Ph.D. at the University of Maryland. He has, for over 20 years, leveraged methods from psychology, neuroscience, biomechanics, and engineering to promote theoretical and empirical understanding of human sensory motor control and development into a primary expertise in human performance and complex behavior. Today, he's talking about trust and automation.
Yes. Yeah. So, in fact,
This is trust and automation.
yeah, we'll see how this goes. If it's going to require you to install something, then I'm not. So yes, we're having automation issues. So I failed to send Veronica the one piece of information that probably would have been more descriptive, which was an appropriate title. This is advertised as ARPI, Trust and Automation. ARPI is the Autonomy Research Pilot Initiative. So that was a program that the Office of Secretary of Defense kicked off back in, they competed it out in 2012. The idea was, hey, autonomy has been promising doing great things for the military for a very long time. Why is it still not doing that, right? And so they threw a bunch of money at it. And they said, 3 years, high risk, high payoff programs, go, right? And so, how are we doing? All right. And so anyway, what I'm going to be talking to you about is a line of research that started under that program, and it is on the topic of trust and automation. So, yep, I'm going to go ahead with presenter mode. There we go. Okay, and that's me. And so I'll start with a little bit of context, right? Because why does the Army care? So what this slide is basically saying is that the world's changing. We all know the world is changing. AI is everywhere. Sensors are everywhere. Everything's being recorded. And this is also going to affect what's going on in the battlefield in dramatic ways. And in fact, it already is going on and already impacting things in dramatic ways. And yet, so I have this statement up here. The Army talks about the character versus nature of war, right? The nature of war is not going to change. The problems that we have, the level of threat that we have, that doesn't change. But how those threats show up, how they play out in the battlefield, in sustainment operations, the Army doesn't just do battle, they do other things. Those things are all changing, right? Increases in agent. And when I say agent, is my code word for anything intelligent. It really could be a person, but I use it as the catch-all. It could be a robot, it could be an AI, it could be an intelligent sensor that's not quite autonomous, right? It's the generic catch-all thing. So continual increases in agent capabilities mean that we need to be doing research and development that's anticipating, incorporating, and adapting to never before seen interactions and task dynamics. And I highlight that because what this is calling for is fundamental research, right? This is saying that there's new science that needs to be happening. And that's where the Army Research Lab comes in. So if you don't know what the Army Research Lab is, we are the basic science house of the Army, right? So we do theory development, we do everything from high energy physics, quantum computing, human agent teaming, which is what I'm talking about today. We do neuroscience, we do all sorts of, they do materials, right? We span the gamut, but it's basic science research. To a point, though, we have a customer. Our customer is the soldier, right? So we do discover, we do innovate. However, we don't pursue lines of research that aren't going to produce something that helps the soldier. If we realize that it's not going to produce a training method, a technology, something, then maybe we've carried the line far enough, but then maybe we transition it to a partner in the medical community or in the academic world, right? So we also do a lot of partnering. We are our identity, the corporate laboratory of the Army. So that means that as scientists, we also have a broader mission, right? One of the things that we do is disruptive foundational research. Another thing we do is we are the sort of clearinghouse and we steward the future, the far future, right? Not 5 years, but 25 years into the future. We're looking to a different world. And we're also supposed to be the face of the Army to academia, right? Because that's where the corpus of intellect and talent and innovation is in our country. So I stand here as kind of a person who has to walk in all these different spaces, right? So I'm with the Human Research and Engineering Directorate. And what we do in the Human Research and Engineering Directorate, we have, ARL has sort of gathered a lot of its research into what's called essential research programs. One of those is in human agent teaming. And essentially, our human autonomy teaming is the current wording for it. But generally speaking, the idea is that trying to transition AI and intelligent technologies from being tools to being teammates, right? It is a rethink on what an AI should be doing and how it should work and what the human's role is and all sorts of things like that. We have a particular program. I noticed this last night. I changed the spelling scheme on the slide. I was drinking a Sprite at the time. So, go figure. Human factors, right? So anyway, and that's what I was just saying. So the world of human autonomy teaming, and I think I'm probably preaching to the choir here. I'm aware of the research that's going on in this area. We think of autonomies and AIs as tools. We think about it as a dyadic relationship, me with my computer, right? We look at the effectiveness of how well that tool performs. But what we're trying to push towards, and in fact, we started a whole new program, a 10-year program called Strengthening Teamwork for Robust Operations in Novel Groups, or a strong program because I'm strong. And so to really try to explore the new science of teamwork that needs to happen when you have teams, but teams that include artificially intelligent agents, right? So where does my world and bias come in, and how does trust and automation fit into this? And by the way, I can get a little bit wordy, and I can sometimes get a little bit detailed. And so I just got to hear all about the FCC thing where the flight operators are giving commands of elevate or decrease or revector. Feel free to give me any of those commands as we're talking, right? If I'm droning into something too detailed, or if you want more details, please let me know. I will do my best to get this whole thing done in the time that we have. So where I come from is, and not just me, the group that I've been working with, is we sort of recognize that in the world of human autonomy relationships, that there's kind of this hierarchical worldview. Right? Take as much of the tasking away from the human as possible, but then ask them for help when the autonomy can't get it. Right? That presumes a lot of things. That presumes that the human's going to give you the right answer. It presumes that the human's available. It presumes that the human's not tired, right? So in other words, humans can and do facilitate resilience of autonomous teams. However, they also add complexity because no two humans are alike, right? In fact, there are probably days where if you looked at my brain, I might look more like Li Xiao than I look like myself. Right? An intelligence system might confuse me for someone else just because the variability within me and the way that I function every day, right? So that human variability provokes a lot of problems. So where does the autonomy, the RP program come in? So when Office of Secretary of Defense put out this call and said, why isn't autonomy being the force multiplier that we expect it to be? And in fact, it's more of a force divider because it takes like 6 people to babysit one, right? So why isn't it working? So we put in a proposal and we basically said, because maybe the world is thinking about how you integrate humans and autonomy not quite the right way, right? This hierarchical worldview where the person sits atop of the command hierarchy and everything is subservient to it. We said, what happens if basically you say a human is essentially equivalent to a sensor, right? Or a controlled element. How does that change your control framework? Well, we recognize, and 2013 was before the word privilege was as pervasively used in society as it is today, so it's not that privilege that we're talking about, that societal, very critical privilege. This is a different conceptualization, right? The conceptualization here is we recognize people have special skills, talents, knowledge. A very easy example is, unlike a lot of nations around the world, or at least some that we're most worried about, the US has a very strict policy about who gets to make lethality decisions, right? And the answer is not in our artificial system. There's a DoD regulation that they can pick the target, they can tell you who you should aim at, but they can't tell you to pull the trigger, right? The human has to do that. So that would be a case where a human has a privilege that isn't computationally necessarily available in a control system sense, right? So how do we imbue control systems with these sorts of privilege? So in other words, if you think about your weighted sum operating systems where you have coefficients on gains on different aspects of the system. So now we're replacing the gain on the human input with this thing called privilege, right? And we've actually instantiated it in several different ways. Weighted sum model is one approach, there's a Bayesian approach, there's a fuzzy approach. We weren't advocating for a specific approach, where this is a framework. And the framework was, if you're going to define privilege for any agent in the system, it doesn't just have to be the human, you take into account these 3 principles: confidence, consequence, multi-scale integration. Confidence is how confident are you in the decision estimate that your agent just gave you, right? How confident are you in the sensor reading that you just got? It could be a simple measure of variability and standard deviation. It could be far more complex than that. Consequence. So you're going to change your decision based on what might likely happen if you went with that control regime versus the other. So you need some sort of, you can operationalize this as a risk-reward ratio, right? That might be one quantitative way that you weight consequence within a system. Multi-scale integration was the part that I always struggled the most with in our control idea, but it's the idea that as we assemble bigger and bigger teams, that the framework should actually kind of be self-similar across levels. So it should operate according to the same principles. And in other words, from a basic sensor fusion element to decision fusion within a system, to decision fusion across multiple systems, to decision fusion across multiple systems of systems, right? That we wanted a framework that would apply across those levels. That's the multi-scale integration. So, of course, we wanted this to be a general solution, and I'm just very quickly pointing out that we did, it was a broad program. We applied it, the principle of confidence specifically in test and evaluation for human autonomy systems. I'm going to talk today about management of trusted automation. It's not lacking a citation because the presentation is, I've got a bunch of stuff sprinkled throughout. These are just 3 examples of papers that you would see. These were the multi-scale, right? So how do we apply these things in a multi-robot slam kind of circumstance of simultaneous localization of methods, or multi-agent visual search or hierarchical visual search. So we pumped out a lot of stuff through the ARPI It ended in 2016, but the line of research didn't. Jumping a little bit forward. So I was a contractor to ARL at the time, and our now chief scientist, Caleb, said, hey, how would you like to go from your current state of knowledge about trust and automation to a real-time online active management system in 3 years? Because that's what the article was. And I had run across trust and automation as like one of those annoying variables that I knew was something that mattered, but it wasn't something that I thought I knew anything about. So we had to spin up, we had to figure out what's an appropriate approach. Very quickly, and this is gonna come up a lot, so I'm gonna walk through it, and then we're gonna bounce back and forth to it, right? The idea is that you have some operator working with some kind of autonomous system, right, or semi-autonomous system. You potentially have ways of reading things about them, whether it's an EEG cap or eye tracking or some sort of skin conductance monitor, or the mouse clicks of their behavior, right? Timestamps can tell you a lot about how quickly a person has responded. Then you fuse that information into something useful for the system, such as inferring a state of trust, right? Then you integrate that with descending task input, stuff that you could get from maps or weather patterns or things that you know. And then you need your weighting functions of how you integrate these things. You need to know what you want to do with it. And then at the end of the day, I really wanted to have this option. We never really did this one yet, right? So there's open areas of research. But you can give the operator feedback or give them some information that might change their behavior. Or if I feel like I need to change trust, because trust is one of those tricky variables, right? From the outset of this program, I'm like, yeah, I guarantee I can make someone lose trust in the system. I'm not sure I can guarantee that I can make them lose it a specific amount, just enough that they doubt it when they need to. And when the system goes into a different circumstance where I know it's going to do better, can I make them trust it more in that circumstance and then push them back, right? So how do I control trust in this very dynamic way? I'm going to give you the advanced planner. I always say I study trust in automation with air quotes because I don't believe, and I didn't believe in 3 years I was going to do this, right? And in fact, I'm going to skip this slide because there's the programmatic. Why did I not believe that I could do this? This was not my research. My colleague, Kristen Schaefer-Lay, did her whole dissertation on trust, human-robot trust with Peter Hancock down at Florida. And she, in her dissertation, counted at that time, which I think was about 2011, 300 definitions of trust. Now, if you're a good engineer, you know you need a precise definition of something before you can put it in a control system, right? And more than 30 of those are HRI, and along this axis are various components of those definitions. And there were a couple of interesting things to note. One of the bigger differences between interpersonal trust and technology-based trust was some inclusion of some concept of risk and uncertainty. And that's going to factor into what I'm talking about here. And Kristen also noted back then, most of the empirical research is, well, how good is the autonomy? We just make it better and let people know that it's going to be better, and then they'll trust it more, right? But there are some components that are missing from those concepts. Kristen also, she did a meta-analysis about how these different factors play into defining a state of trust. So this is she calls it the 3-factor model that she worked on with Peter Hancock. And the idea is that, there are factors about the people, and there are factors about the robot, and there are factors about the environment, all of which come together to influence a trust state. When I came onto the scene, what I was tasked with was this trust calibration over time, and I needed to get to trust-based outcomes. And that's where, this is the part where I often say that it seems to me, or it seemed to me back then, that there was a kind of field of dreams model in the field in general about trust and behavior, right? So field of dreams, for those of you that never saw the movie, if you build it, they will come. If you build the baseball field, the baseball players will come and play, right? If you establish the trust people will just do the right thing. But I'm not sure I believe that, right? Why? Well, in some cases, if you have a person's reporting their trust, and then how they behave is very consistent. I trust a train, I get on it, I write it. I trust a plane, I get on it, I write it, right? But we can also think of circumstances where that relationship is broken, right? Maybe this guy is not trusted who's driving. I'm not trying to be gender biased, it's just the flip art I have. Not a statement on anything else, right? Or part of the excitement of riding a roller coaster for me is I don't entirely trust that I'm going to get off the other end safely, but I'll still ride it. It doesn't say anything about my level of trust, right? So what I'm trying to lay out here, and in fact, it's not just this logical pattern. I had a postdoc at the time, Dr. Kim Gurnett, who has moved on, did a literature review of the entire field of human factors related to human trust and automation. And the one question was, can we come up with a consistent mapping, a way of consistently mapping for any given individual in any given context, a trust level with a behavioral outcome, right? Instead, what she came back to me was, no, I can't do that, Jason, because there are lots of cases where people say they trust, but they're bored, so they take over anyway, right? Or they say they don't trust, but their workload is so darn high that, okay, well, it's good enough, right? So there's a discrepancy. And there are lots of models, lots of mechanisms trying to explain this out in the literature. And yet there still isn't a very clear definition of how you map trust to behavior, right? So that's why I do this. Because my smoke and mirrors here, as a behavioral scientist, my background is in kinesiology, was I'll bet you I can predict behavior more consistently than I can predict a trust state. And I'll bet you that if I can predict that behavior far enough in advance, and I know some ground truth about what the system's supposed to be doing, maybe I can get in there and shift the behavior to the right direction. Right? This is a very practical engineering thing at this point, right? How can I influence the system and how can I do it far enough in advance? So there comes the ARPI. I'm going to kind of skip ahead and give some, those of you who study trust might recognize this as Barney Mirror's model, persistence, competence, fiduciary responsibility. But ultimately, at the end of the day, when it comes to trust, people make observations of the system, they have expectations of the system given that environment, and they make a decision, right? Well, what was really cool about that is we work in a group that is very heavily neuroscience and brain-computer interaction. So while I may not be able to predict the trust state, we were aware, and this is not ours, but there are plenty of models in cognitive neuroscience, decision neuroscience, drift diffusion models, leaky integrator models, models that you can read brain activity and say someone is approaching an A or B decision. And I can actually kind of predict which decision they're heading towards, which means I can do that in advance. And why am I emphasizing the advance? Well, because some systems, well, if you wait on the behavior, well, the error's already happened by the time you want to mitigate it, right? You need to find out that it's going to go wrong before it goes wrong. So we wanted to set up a paradigm. How could we study, how could we try to get at the decision of what to do with the system? So we developed a paradigm, and this is not just us. This was a big program. You'll see my slide at the end. It takes a village. This was a meeting I had with James Christensen at AFRL, that's Air Force Research Laboratory. And we were sort of spitballing different ideas. How can we get to the decision, right? And there are some established things in the literature that we know. We know that the automation reliability really does matter, and it matters a lot. I'm not dismissing that. We know that task difficulty and workload factors heavily into when a person decides when and how to use the system, right? And this was the PSF, the privileged sensing framework. How does consequence factor into this? Well, the advanced planner is, for me, consequence equals risk, right? At least on one level. James, however, had done some studies on trust and automation, and he looked at this workload versus varying automation reliability conditions, And so these are brain scans. If you're not used to seeing EEG data, the different colors just represent the magnitude of signal that you're getting at different parts of the brain. And I don't know about you, but across that axis, I'm not seeing a whole lot. And without being able to access that's like where the decisions are happening, right? I want the EEG, but the EEG may not be able to tell me about that unless because it's potentially being swamped by the effects of the workload, right? So we're like, okay, so we have to design a paradigm that will both control for the workload component as well as play with the reliability component, right? So at a very, very basic level, and this is a speed, and I pre-ordered my talk because I think it works better this way, is a very simple 2x2 speed control versus full control. What that actually allowed us to do is maintain workload while changing the reliability. So what do I mean by that? So here's the paradigm. It's a leader-follower driving task. Why a driving task? I've studied driving for a long time. Driving is a very well-characterized task. People don't have to be trained on it. Well, they do, but not by the time they were in my study. We didn't have to explain the consequence structure. People pretty much know don't hit things, right? However, we had to do this in a safe way. And there's another advanced planner on this. It didn't entirely work because we did it in simulation. And I'm really starting to believe that you cannot induce real-world sense of risk in simulation. You can try and try and try. You can pay them. We threatened that they would lose $100, and they were like undergraduates. Like $100 should have been a lot to undergraduates, and it didn't matter. So advanced planner, the risk thing didn't work in time. But the paradigm. So they were simulated riding in this vehicle. They're supposed to be following that vehicle, maintaining a certain distance, right? A specific range, not a specific distance, but a range. They had to stay in their lane. There's ambient traffic coming along. So if they did deviate too far, they'd hit it and they'd lose points. And just to keep it interesting and just so that we could do the neuroscience part as well, and this is perhaps the most artificial part, this is a top-down view of people that were just popping in as you're driving along. Roughly one every 7 seconds, and I think it was about 15% of them after they popped in, and there was a very small delay that was not intentional. It was an artifact of the simulation, but it actually worked nicely. After a very small delay, they would decide to walk in front of you. And so while they're driving, they're also, I mean, originally the idea was honk the horn and tell them to get out of the way, right? So they had a little remote controller, and if it was a dynamic moving pedestrian, they pushed one button, and if it was a static one, they pushed the other. So they had to make a differentiation, right? And part of that was because if you've studied EEG, you know that there's an oddball paradigm that gives you nice brain signals that are predictable as well, right? So it was also based loosely on the oddball paradigm. And we also did this in a full motion, 6 degree of freedom motion platform in a place that is now called GVSC, Ground Vehicle Systems Center. It used to be called the Technology Research Development and Engineering Center in Detroit, Michigan. And the reason I wanted to do it in the simulator, because that's much more expensive, is I thought immersion would help engage that sense of this is real and this is risky. It still didn't do it. But anyway, so our results, and I think I'm doing okay. Am I going too fast? Is everybody okay so far? We're good? Yes? Okay. Because now I'm going to get into a whole series of results of things that we've worked on, and I'm not going to claim great responsibility for most of it because it's brilliant postdocs and engineers and people that I've worked with. I've steered, I've helped, I've participated in the analyses, but please, and you'll see pictures of faces of the people who did all of it. So the first level was, did our paradigm even work, right? So did we balance the workload and still see a difference in the trust, right? So the typical effects were replicated. So what we have here, and I'm sorry I jumped ahead. We had, I did do that. So we had the full in speed, and I didn't explain that to you. So the idea was full automation was basically the equivalent of adaptive cruise control and lane keeping, right? So they didn't really have to steer, or they didn't have to control their speed, and there were perturbations. So it wasn't just like they let it maintain a steady state. There were wind gusts that were pushing them out of their lane. The lead vehicle, being as nice as it was, would occasionally speed up and slow down, right? And because we didn't want to have a saliency bias, we didn't use the brake lights. So they really had to watch the behavior of the vehicle in front of them. So that's full control. And full control meant both of those elements were either on or off. And what that meant is when the elements were on, then the human had nothing else to do except push buttons for the pedestrians, right? When they were off, they had to do everything. So big workload difference, right? SH and SL, and the H and L are high and low reliability. So in other words, good and bad automation. Automation that might hit someone. Well, there was no obstacle avoidance part. So the human was always responsible for that part, is avoiding the pedestrians and the other cars. It was simply things like a level 2 automation in the SAE study. Speed, what the speed only was, is that was the adaptive cruise, but they still had to maintain their speed, their steering. And we played a little bit of a trick on them, and that is in the speed high condition, meaning it was a really good adaptive cruise that they didn't need to intervene in at all. It was spot on. We made the steering harder. So we gave them more perturbations and higher magnitude perturbations. They didn't really know a difference. But the idea was, and we didn't do an imprint model or whatever to calculate workload, and I'm not sure that really necessarily would have helped us anyway, but the idea was that was supposed to balance the workload, right? Because in the low condition, then, you know, they were working hard enough because the thing was screwing up and going to hit the vehicle. Okay, so now that I've explained that, the typical effects we're seeing when the workload confound was allowed to be there, right, in the full autonomy conditions. System trustworthiness, which was based also on the mirror visual analog scales, right? From high reliability to low reliability, they said it was less trustworthy. Their reliance, right, the amount that they were willing to use it dropped basically linearly, right? And the workload went up from one to the other because they had to work harder in the other, right? But were we able to break the relationship a little bit? Well, we did see that when subjective trust, and I say may be preserved. So remember, this is in some initial work, the slope of that line changed a little bit. The trust didn't drop as much. There's a nuance on that, maybe ask me about it later, but I don't want to go into it at the moment. But the reliance pattern still dropped, right? And though we saw a greater spread on whether the people were willing to use the autonomy or not, right? So people started making different decisions in this context versus that. And then finally, you know, the workload, it was not significantly different between the high and the low and the speed only. It was significantly different in the other, right? So what this basically said is our paradigm was doing mostly what it was supposed to be doing. And the initial interpretation was essentially, you know, yes, trust matters, but other things matter too, essentially, right? Going a little bit further, and this was a paper that we did actually get invited to resubmit back to human machine systems, but we were deciding to go somewhere else for different reasons. We did some stepwise regression modeling because we also had recorded, this is from the cognitive uncertainty, the cognitive uncertainty response scale. And this is from the big 5, right? Personality things. And then on top of it, we had our subjective workload, our trusted automation, because we thought those mattered. And we had measures of automation type and quality. So this first column, REL means reliance. How much were they willing to use the automation? hopefully that's not surprising to anyone, that the things that remained in after the iterations were, and we used a really conservative criterion. It had to be at 0.001 for us to talk about it in the paper, because stepwise regression is abusive on statistics and power. But anyway, so the things that met that criterion were basically the automation quality, how good it was, workload, and trustworthiness determined how much they relied, how much they used the automation. We did allow workload, these things to kind of predict each other. So we saw though that workload was predicted by trust, mostly. These guys, the ones in the little dash boxes, were technically significant, but we don't really want to talk about them that much. However, it makes sense that both neuroticism and automation quality had some effect on the trust as well. Those have been shown in the literature, so it's not ridiculous that they popped out, but yeah, all the reasons. The trust was an interesting one though, because the trust actually did involve more personality components, more individual difference components. We saw design, cognitive, how a person responds to cognitive uncertainty, how much they like change affected their trust decisions. The subjective workload, of course, was in their automation type of quality, and we also got extroversion and openness to experience, other things that have been seen in the literature, but again, low power. So, okay, so we're seeing some interesting things, but this is all done in the aggregate, and it's all done at the correlation level. So we're going back to the trust management concept, right? Reminding you where we're at. What we really want to try to do is start pushing towards some sort of online real-time predictor, right? So Greg Gremion, aerospace engineering background, started poking around at the continuous behavior and essentially noted that reliance dips when autonomy performs poorly, right? He also sort of noticed and believes that he is saying that there's a bias that when a person is holding control, their reliance differs, it's much more mixed than when they've decided to give the autonomy control. And Greg hates that I put this up, but I think it's instructive. So his very first way of doing this during his postdoc is he created this performance tally. Are you doing better? Are you doing worse? Right? And a risk tally. And so this is the course that people were driving, right? The greens are when the automation was driving. The red is when the person took over. This is when it was a good autonomy, and hopefully you realize it was a bad one, right? And if you map the, so if you map a performance metric, so 0 means everything's going great, red means more error is increasing, right? And so if you look very closely just in this S curve, and the S curves were intentionally put in, it wasn't like we just bought a pathway. We put things in because we knew how driving autonomy screws up. Driving autonomy notoriously cuts corners. It doesn't like tight hairpin turns. So that was the one place where it allowed us to play with a really bad autonomy. And so essentially what you're seeing here is, okay, everything's going great, error starting to increase, error starting, okay, I'm going to hand off or take over, right, because the autonomy was controlled for the automation. I'm going to take over. Oh, it's going good for a little bit. Nope, error's starting to increase. Let me hand it over. It's going, no, errors are increasing. Let me hand off again. Right? So the metric actually is kind of nice because the performance indicates a little bit about when and how a person decides, right, to hand off. And so there's that. But then the other thing that Greg did is he created a risk map. And risk was indications of, are you likely to hit a vehicle? Are you drifting towards the edge of the road? Is there a pedestrian in the way? Is the risk increasing or decreasing? And I only put this up here so I can show the next comparison, which is essentially, if I put in my little animation for this particular case, you see some handoffs here that were not caught by the performance metric, but you saw a local maximum in risk at that moment when the handoffs happened. So there was some colloquial evidence that, okay, risk is factoring in here. We care about risk. I only put this in here to say that, so how do we use this information and relate it to a driver to maybe help shift their behavior around? I put this in here, senior scientist in my lab, Jesse Chen, tells us that situation awareness-based transparency really matters a lot. Kristen Schaefer, my other colleague that I mentioned earlier, said that with driving-based technologies that transparency should be about the intent or something about the way the driving is going to drive. So we did a second experiment where we decided to provide a control system based, we called it the actuator, because Greg's an aerospace engineer. It's a feedback system. So essentially, in any one of these, A means autonomy, automation, M means manual mode, right? The closer the ball was here, then you should be using this mode, please. The closer it drifted here, you should use this mode, please. The ball got brighter because we wanted it to be more salient. The little chevron just was a way that we could see which mode were they in, right? So in this case, they're in automation mode, but they really should be switching to manual, right? And so we essentially repeated the same experiment, same course. Actually, we made it a little bit longer. And again, there's details here that I'm going to skip over, but we actually varied the point structure systematically throughout the course under different conditions. And then we factored that consequence information into the control of this guy in one condition. In another condition, we ignored the consequence and just said, here's the probability. So how did this thing work? All right. Essentially what Greg did, and because of time, I'm going to say that he had the risk component. In this case, it was very simple. Conditional probability tables based on the first study. Where does autonomy screw up? Where does a person screw up? Right? That set a baseline. However, we also recognize, so this in the loop right here is, how are you currently performing? I don't care what the history of people in this thing is. If you're screwing up right now, maybe you should hand off or take over, right? So there's a combination of both current performance and probability of error fused. And then we had a way of changing the rating based on the consequence of who should be in control at a given time. And we provided that feedback to people, right? Again, for sake of time, I was going to show you a little video of it, but let's go ahead and skip past it. The story was, again, it worked only a little, right? Why do we say it worked a little? Well, essentially, this chart here is an indication of the error in the orange when they were not doing what we told them to do, or the actuator told them to do, and the green was error rates on the task when they followed the recommendation of the actuator, right? That's kind of a little bit of a no-duh. We set it up that way. It's not anything foundational. We didn't see a whole lot of increase across, well, so we did see a general increase from not having that information. NA means no actuator. Unscaled means we didn't include the consequence. CA means we included the consequence. Maybe there's some increase by helping the person understand the consequence structure of the task included on top of what the performance likelihoods were. So what about these guys? Because this was only the behavior, but we really wanted to get to the prediction of the decision state. So we had another postdoc, his name is Evan Carter, who's now at University of New Mexico, so you guys would probably go visit him right now. I know it's a little bit far, but closer than Maryland. But anyway, so Evan actually did a agnostic predictor of handoff decisions based on, so I put these up because they're different features that he abstracted. Inverse time to contact and the nearest target, theta power from the EEG, is there a perturbation on or off, theta power EEG, curvature of the road, right? So the thing about the environmental features is they're easy, that they could actually be abstracted in the real world. They're not just stuff that we could only get in simulation. And he used a recursive addition method, basically stepwise regression, but for machine learning. And which features popped up, and I'm not going into all of that right now, but what ended up happening was, so here we have So he did this is just his cross-validation method across the number of features in the feature set. So we had up to like 40 features, different environment features, different EEG features. We had skin conductance, we had heart rate, we had a bunch of stuff. We just threw it all in there and said, what of this could predict? What was his target versus non-target, for those of you who like classifiers? So what he basically did, since we had all the data, is went through the data set and found every handoff or takeover, right? And then he backed off from that authority toggle event by 3 seconds, and then defined an epoch of 10 seconds, right? And took all of these features in that 10 seconds, 3 seconds before the handoff. That's important, right? And then those were the target. Those were true, right? Because we know that they're connected to the handoff. And then basically every other part of the course that was not that was non-target because there was no handoff. And then he fed it into what's called an HDCA, a hierarchical discriminant classifier. I forget what the A is. Paul Scheida's work really, and Amar Marate, who I worked with on this, he did a lot of work with that. So it's a sliding window classifier, regression-based, I believe. And so could this classifier detect target versus non-target beyond chance 3 seconds before the actual thing happened that we were trying to predict? And essentially what this is saying is, so the gold, or ones that you can hardly see, that's for the handoff events. The greens are for the takeovers, right? So takeover is automation is driving. Person's like, no, 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 I'm going to drive now, right? Handoff was, I don't want to drive anymore. And I say this is very predictable. We did a better job, in some cases, beyond 80% accurate at predicting takeover events 3 seconds before they happen. In this very contrived circumstance, right, that we set up to do that. We didn't do as well with the handoffs. And there's other ways that he looked at the data. The goal is also the handoffs. The lines are essentially, the dashed lines are your null hypothesis. The solid line is the meaning of the cluster, right? And what you see is the handoffs, predictor's probably not working so well. The greens are well beyond the cross-validation null point. So at least we're getting the takeovers. Frankly, I think that's a no-duh finding because takeovers happen under fairly common circumstances. It's the, oh crud, I'm about to hit something, I'm gonna take over, right? Handoff is more individual variability driven, right? My style of risk versus your style of risk. We didn't have anything in those models that indexed those things. Right? And then we tried to do, this is, I only put this up here, Kim Bernick, so back to her. She actually, we took that physiological information, that classifier, and we made it a condition on that actuator. And we're running the study again, so now it's closed loop, right? Because one of the conditions, what happened was if the physiology said, no decision is likely to be happening, or we're not detecting it, but there should be a change decision, then we just made the stimulus stronger, like, hey, we're telling you to change and you're not looking like you're going to change, and vice versa, right? And so essentially, 5 subjects, by the way, pilot experiment. We saw a very slight bump. Maybe the physiological actuator, the closed loop one, was a little bit more trustworthy. It was really no different in terms of workload, and I wouldn't call this different in terms of performance, right? But I mean, frankly, if I can get something a little bit more trusted without a decrement to performance, that's not bad. Right? So we still may bark up this tree a bit more. Kim took a job, moved on. So that's why there are only 5 subjects. Actually, there are 9, but this is for an HCII paper. That's all she had analyzed to that point. And then a final piece in our last 7-ish minutes. I'll try to buzz through this. So Greg Grenion actually, it's interesting at ARL. I was saying at lunch to that you know, a nice thing about working in the government is my life is not driven by trying to establish a continuous line of funding. I don't really have to compete. But we actually do at ARL to keep our science fresh, to keep our science, to keep people on their toes. We compete the internal one, at least for basic science, right? So Greg Gremion, who was a postdoc but is now a full-on civilian employee of ARL, got himself a 6-1. It's a basic research study, 3 to 5 years worth of money to continue this line. And so Greg worked with Brandon Perlman, Kristen was part of this, Kathy Neubauer, who's out in California, and they wanted to start looking at potential individual differences to predict better. And what Greg is doing is the more ambitious one. Can he predict the real-time decision state, right? And what I mean by that is, what we were doing before, we only knew a decision happened when it happened. Greg's trying to come up with a predictor that is now trying to get at that hidden variable. Am I drifting towards a decision, right? And that's really what the control that we're trying to get at. So there's 2 parts to this. Do not buy this fully. Because I just have a hard time. So they did this work and I'm still poking at them a little bit because I'm like, how in the heck in 15 or 16 subjects you identify 4 clusters? I just do not buy it. Even with bootstrapping, it doesn't make sense. However, what I will say is I might believe that there were 2 different groups, potentially, right? And it sort of kind of looks like there may have been a group here, a group here, and a group here, and a group here. The only reason I'm telling you about it now, though, is it wasn't just this. So this is a trust score. How much did they trust across the different autonomy type, automation types, right? These are just, they were classified or clustered based on the responses to the personality scores, and then looked at their performance. So Kathy Neubauer, we also had face video. So she started looking at facial expressions, emotional expressivity. And so black, red, green, blue maps to, your black, red, green, blue here. So, and essentially, this is too complicated of a graphic to fully explain, other than just pointing out that each of these groups seem to have distinctively different expressivity patterns, number 1. And then those expressivity patterns, so these means are reflected in distance from origin, right? To the extent that you're seeing values up here, this is expressivity, it's when the human was driving, here is when the autonomy was driving off the diagonal, right? So these groups were separating out in what they were reacting to and what context they were reacting in, right? And Kathy further, I was playing with it last night, I pulled it out. She actually did event-related analyses on handoffs and point violations, and you see different squiggly lines time-locked at different things, right? Again, too preliminary to make a big story about, other than to say there appear to be individual differences that we are not accounting for. We didn't account for in Levin's model. We didn't account for it in Greg's model that ignored the human mostly, right? So we're trying to push towards that individual difference component. And Greg is using this information in a new model. So he's using a stochastic filtering technique. It's called a particle filter. Don't ask me anything more than that, because I don't really know Bayesian modeling and I don't really know particle filtering techniques. But essentially a particle filter is a way of, you can call it a function approximator, right? You have a squiggly line and it continually resamples and tests hypotheses. Is this really a squiggle or not, right? Essentially. Right? So it's reconstructing some sort of complex trajectory. And the way he does it is, so you have, so in the red, right, you have state variables. So in this case, a human state would be stress. A robot state might be position. We have environmental inputs or actuator inputs, like the motor inputs. So the road curvature could be treated as an input to the human, to the particle filter. These are observables, heart rate variability, behavioral toggle, with control authority, right? And he puts these together in what's called a dynamic Bayesian network, right? So you assemble these inputs, output layers, predicting these decision layers, right? And then you slide them across time. And then let's see if this video works. And so what you're going to see here, you see the inputs up top. They're scaled and they're meaningless. Outputs scaled. But he has a nifty little animation here. If you look at the dark blue line in the middle, right? The toggle went off, decision statement low, toggle went on, decision statement high, right? So he's tracking the decision state, parameterizing now not just on the behavior, but also on some of these other stress-related variables. But the other important part, and I can't press forward it, what this allows us to do is also find sub-threshold states. In other words, things where the decision almost happened, but it didn't happen. And we wouldn't have known that, right? And so he shows that when you look at some of these lines here where it dipped low, but you didn't see a change in control output, right? So we're pushing towards, we're trying to get towards that decision state, which will allow us to predict, which will allow us to then, now the other piece is, we don't have a really good answer about what do we do with that, right? Because that little floaty ball thing was not very effective. And I'm guessing a lot of human factors people are in here, and I know I got like a minute left, so I can wrap up here. And this is my next slide, is my last slide. If you give someone a suggestion with no consequence for not taking that suggestion, it's their option, right? And I firmly believe for something like this to work, and in fact, I'm not making this up. We did the power plant simulations. I think that was Lee and C, or not Lee and C, but many years ago, before when I was still in graduate school studying babies learning how to stand up, they basically showed that what you do in a situation like this is you put in a system timeout. I am going to take over unless you veto me in the next second, right? If you have enough evidence to suggest that a takeover should happen, and you give the person the option, but you force the decision. And I really think we need a stronger influence if we're going to do it just through a transparent interface, right? Our evolving understandings, I believe trust may be necessary, but it's not sufficient. I don't necessarily believe that if I want to influence human autonomy interaction, even in a trust case, that I need to operate on trust. I think trust matters. I think I need to build a trustworthy system. I think maybe we can understand the factors that influence trust, but for real-time influence, I think we need to target the behavior. That's a message that I've been trumpeting for years. There's evidence to support that I'm not making up, that we can predict things far enough in advance to do something about it. And we're starting to see that potentially individualized models will give us even more power to do that, maybe even further out, right? And with that, I can't believe I finished only 1 minute late. Thank you. Questions? Hi. You mean the big stepwise tabling where I slid through?
The mean AUC, that's usually composite score.
Oh, okay. No, so an AUC is when you do, so you would look this up if you wanted to learn about, it's called receiver operating characteristic curve. It's a way of assessing a classifier's performance. So a classifier, you can have different error types, right? You can have false positives, false negatives, true positive, true negative. So an AUC curve says how well you're balancing, like you're getting the right targets, but not saying a target is a target when it's not a target, and vice versa, right? So what you really want to see in a AUC curve is the more rectangular it is, the closer that value is to 1, means if it was 1, it would be 100% accurate. To the extent that you see different shapes of the curve means that there's less accuracy in particular ways. Right. Well, that was just saying how well the classifier was doing at predicting the values. Right. Or it's one metric of doing that. There's other ways to do it.
I like the actuator a lot because it aligns my use of automation with this kind of person needs to take over and there's no particular. But from the participant's point of view, how are they separating that from the automation? They're already skeptical to automation, and are they going to believe that?
It's actually, we did index that, and it hasn't been analyzed. So in other words, in that second study, when we now had an actuator, it's technically another automation, right? So we actually separately asked them about the automation and the actuator and how much they trusted each. Unfortunately, right now, I can't answer that. We have the data. But you're absolutely right. Part of the reason why the actuator, I mean, if we went back to those curves, you would also see those box and whisker plots. Those boxes were pretty good. Yeah. And so there's a lot of individual variability in the way that people responded to the actuator. And potentially, if we conditioned on that trust of the actuator, right, the trust of the sliding ball, maybe we would get different answers too. Maybe we would see one group did trust it and another group didn't. And in fact, we actually, so colloquially, where did our participants come from? So University of Michigan, Department of Engineering, graduate program, mostly. But there were actually some people who didn't have technical knowledge of how autonomy works, and people who basically were more technical and understood were more accepting of all the automations we gave them. And the people who were kind of like it's all a mystery to them were a lot less, but that's entirely colloquial. I don't have a whole heck of a lot to really strongly make that claim, but it was yeah.
How do you consider actuator giving information on reality?
Like auditory. So the actuator ball was something we picked on some level because of empirical convenience, right? It's easily controllable. We can easily calculate the compliance with it. In addition, there weren't as many salience problems. So like an auditory thing. So these Stewart platform driving simulators can get pretty loud, especially the hydraulic ones, right? And so we couldn't do that. Now I think there is an interesting, is maybe if we did a multimodal cue. So in other words, maybe when the ball got to the one end and the person's ignoring it, maybe we start vibrating the steering wheel, right? And actually, so I'm not doing that work. We have a complex team simulator at APG that people are working on, right? And they are actually looking at the effects of multimodal. So I think not a different modality, but multiple modalities would probably strengthen.
So I would imagine that the actuator would normally be recommended to people or manual control. That's normal, right, during the S program. Did the participants beforehand know that, okay, there's going to be an external support and the automation for that on that, or did they just have to learn that the automation?
No, so the paradigm actually, everybody got training and they got a sandbox time with the system beforehand. They got, and we did it in a graduated way. So, and in fact, we took advantage of the fact that we had identified participants because they were kind of hard to get in the first study. So about half the second study's participants were already in the first study. But regardless, when they came in, first, we assume most people have not ridden on a motion simulator before, right? So we would start them out driving on the course, just driving without the games turned up to move the simulator around. Then after, I forget how much time, right? We turned on the games. So now they're feeling the drive. And that also proved to be a really good thing to help with people who get motion sick in these simulators, because if they're likely to get sick, they often get sick early. And it was really helpful if they got sick during the training, because then it's like, okay, well, here's $50 for coming in today, but yeah, we're not going to make you any more sick. Right? But then we introduced them slowly to paradigms. So, right, so after they got that motion, then they approached the vehicle, the other vehicle, and now they're doing the leader follower task. And then we actually introduced them to the different automations. Half of them would get the bad automation first, half would get the full automation first. And then we later introduced the slider bar, right? So they all hit, and the other thing is experimental design for all your experimental design wonks. It was not a full factorial, completely counterbalance design across all conditions because the manual run always went first. The driving without any automation always went first. And the reason for that is because the predictor model actually needed the person's baseline behavior. So that slider bar was actually tuned to each individual person's error profile, not a generic person's error profile. And that was tuned based, it was actually, Greg had several ways of doing it. We could tune it to an aggregate, we could tune it to an aggregate plus their individual profile and just their individual profile. I forget exactly which we did, but that actuator reflected the likelihood of their error versus the automation's error, right? So it was, so no, they didn't have the advanced cues. The other thing that we did, and I don't have the data to talk about it, but I had mentioned that consequence, right? I don't think I have slides here. Let me see if I do though. Because I have a lot of extra stuff. Yeah, no, I don't have that. In the second study, the one with the actuator, the other thing that we did was we broke the course up into segments, something like 21 different segments, right? And we differentially prioritized the points on lane keeping versus range keeping. We would flick the consequence. Sometimes they were equal, right? So errors in both were equally consequential. Sometimes lane keeping was worse. We wanted to pay more attention, and sometimes range. And why do we pick that? And this relates to your question, so I'm not making something. The automations were way better at range keeping, right? If they were likely to screw up the automations, they were likely to screw up in lane keeping, especially on curves. People were better on curves, right? So we broke the course up into zones based on straightaway, curve, S-curve, right? So we broke it into zones, and then we would flip those relationships, right? So we actually had conditions where in the S-curve, despite the fact that we know that people were better, we changed the consequence structure that they should prefer the lane keeping one instead, right? That's a level of analysis I haven't gotten to yet, but the goal, that was really for the privilege sensing framework piece, is could we use consequence structure to flip their behavior to the opposite of what it should have been, right? Colloquially, we saw that in some cases, but again, I don't have a lot of the details to say that everybody cued into that. They had driven the entire course. They knew where the automation was likely to fail. They knew where they were likely to fail, is what I think your basic question is.
I could ask more questions, but I also want to direct us to there's a question that came in the group chat.
Oh.
About 20 minutes before the end here. So I don't know if you can access that, just to read it.
Oh, here.
Is that on your screen?
No, it's on.
Okay, yeah, let's see if we can read it.
How is system trustworthiness measured? So system trustworthiness was measured, if you're familiar with the 1987 two-part series paper by Mir and Murray. They had the theory of trust, and then they had the experiments on the theory of trust. Their metric, they had a set of 5 visual analog scales, right? So just a line from 0 to 100. How dependable do you think the autonomy is? How reliable, like how consistently will it perform? So there were 4 different We actually omitted the fifth factor, and now it's been so long I forget why we omitted the fifth factor, but system trustworthiness was the average across the floor, the top floor in the merit scale. We did also measure using the Gian scale, and we saw similarities. In some of the major things, they agreed with each other. System trustworthiness actually scaled better with the reliance than the Gian scale did. So how reliable is the full autonomy simulated, and how is full autonomy achieved, and how do researchers determine it is reliable? So to answer that question, I will pull up the paradigm slide. So essentially what we did is a two-part thing here. So what I'm showing on the chart, so I didn't highlight when I explained this. Scoot this guy out of the way. So what you see, that's okay, I just need this. So you see these distributions here and here, right? So the high reliability autonomy was not perfect at lane keeping. It had some small amount of variability, but it would never hit the other vehicle. But we did tune it manually, essentially, so that this distribution overlapped enough that sometimes the bad autonomy would hit the other vehicle. Same thing with the high and the low is these distributions on lane keeping behavior. The high reliability autonomy would not drift out of the lane. The low reliability might just hit another car, especially if a perturbation was turned on. How did we scale that then? Essentially, at one point we played with a bunch of different methods, and we did it entirely empirically. So in other words, asked 10 people from Tardec to go do manual drives around the course, calculate their error rates. This is actually, for the human systems engineering people, this is actually an interesting story, right? When we actually set out to do this paradigm, we had automation is way better than you, automation is way worse than you, or no automation, right? And that sort of set up this kind of no-duh circumstance where either the way better or the way worse, people kind of tuned out, but the one that actually got them engaged was the automation that looked just like another person. So in other words, we tuned the variability of the autonomy, or the automation. I keep saying autonomy, but it's a driving automation, it's a bad habit. But the automation was actually tuned, the bad automation was tuned to look like the average variability of another person. That's a colloquial thing. That's exactly what we did, but there was no quantified way that we did it.
So I guess I have a question. So it seems like you kind of got into this idea of predicting the decision, which I think is interesting and solid that we get role. There's always been a disagreement in trust and reliance.
Right.
Behavior versus belief.
Yes.
But so in my head, all I could think was, it seems like you're also then assuming that you can understand what the outcome of that decision is. So in driving, that's very true. If I put you on a trajectory toward a hazard and there's a certain amount of speed, if you don't brake at a certain time, you hit it, period. It's definable, it's physics.
Yes.
Whereas some of the states, I think, occur in more complicated automated systems are not as clearly deterministic, and that's part of the problem. So the supermax kind of problem, component max 37,
right.
Some of these other more complicated systems have these areas where it's not clear, there's a lot of uncertainty.
Yes.
And so you can't just say, well, if we predict whether or not this person flips the switch, then we know it's good or bad. It's more like, we might predict it, but then we still don't know what happens.
You're absolutely right, because there's a whole performance component. Now, the decision state, the particle filter model that Greg's working with actually took into account some performance variables.
So cool.
However, the other piece of that is this was very contrived. And the reason I say that, because we were going for proof of concept, right? We had a big challenge inside 3 years, and I'm trying to find my chart here. The only way the decision neuroscience models currently work, so I'm pulling up this graphic, right? You have to have an A and a B, an A, a B, a C, D, E, or F. And so we intentionally set up this paradigm so that we knew it was one or the other. And it was a proof of concept. If you could envision your system in such a way that you can distill it to choices and identify epochs where people are making choices and you know what those choices are. Can you look for the signature that they're tending towards one choice or another? Actually, what we couldn't do in this paradigm, but what works remarkably well in that case is using eye movement, right? So for instance, your Boeing situation is the pilot sitting there and then shifting their eye to that switch. Like, and there's been studies, and the neural metrics actually correlated with it. The more regularly you're looking at that button, the more likely you are you're about to flip it, right? And so you can apply the same drift diffusion or leaky integrator models to an eye movement trace instead of an EEG trace, if you can boil your situation down to and track what they're looking at, right? And you can also get an indicator of, I'll bet you they're about to touch that button, right? So there's other ways that you can do it too. This paradigm is not amenable for that. Because, right, so, and in fact, I didn't really explain how did you turn on and off automation, right? So when they wanted to take over, they just either stepped on one of the brake or the gas, right, the throttle. Yeah, they had to interact with the foot pedals, not necessarily the steering. They couldn't force the steering wheel, and there's just physical safety reasons. Servo motor was strong, and we didn't want people fighting the servo motor. When they wanted to re-engage the automation, it was actually like, did you ever have a car that had the high beams on the floor? Cars used to have high beams that you would actuate with your left foot. There was a little button on your floor. So we used that idea, and there was a toggle button at the left foot that they could turn it back on with that. So everything was on and off with their feet.
So that's a perfect segue to another question I have is, I think a lot of people want to put automation in their body in places where humans are going to make a mistake to prevent it. So there's another piece of this. I don't really. Okay, so we may have to cut it a little short.
Okay.
Apologies. But so again, like automation is going to prevent mistakes, and so a lot of the driving automation is a system that would predict if you were going to hit stuff and would intervene. That doesn't seem to be the case.
In other words, why would you automate this if you could predict that you were about to hit something than just actuate a piece of it or not?
No, not necessarily that. More like the PSF framework, as I understood it, is about taking in both what the system knows about the human, but also what the human knows about the system, and having that all play into like wow. So,
yeah, sort of. I mean, the way the PSF was initially put together, it really didn't actually matter what the agents knew about each other. It was more of a central system mediating the blend of, right? So, for instance, so in the ties paper, the theoretical issues, and it's obnoxiously long. Oh, okay. So you saw the classifier, what they did with the RSVP system, right? Which is you had people doing what they were doing well, you had the automation doing what it was doing well. We set it up as a viewing model, or Omar set it up as a viewing model, and it was just intelligently trying to blend the best of both worlds and minimize the people who are really slow and the RSVP or the computer vision system in that case would cap out at like 60% or 70% accurate, whereas people, would drive it towards higher accuracy. So, but the point is, it's a sort of system in the middle. The people didn't really need to know what the computer vision systems were doing. The computer visions didn't, and same with well, here they do them, but they don't have to. I mean, we didn't really implement a PSF per se here. But
I guess what I was saying that index, in other words, the centralized control has to be about human state.
Yeah.
And performance.
Mhm.
And so I think that part here.
Not in the experiments.
Right, there's no central thing that's knowing about it.
Yeah,
How
the-
well-
Well, so except that in Greg's model, and I didn't, so in the actuator model, so there were conditional probability tables for both the human and the automation, right? So it was essentially a subtraction, right? And then the same thing, so what we actually did, so that's what this sampled piece is. So whoever was driving, we could calculate. Yeah. I'll finish the statement. Whoever was driving, we could actually calculate their performance. But we said, well, if the other one was driving, how would it be driving right now? And essentially, we sampled from the distribution
Okay.
of past performance. That's what that's about. Yeah. No.